This is Declarations.
I think we look at the Declaration as a document that is embodying the principles that we hopefully will live up to and stand for, but obviously we haven't done it perfectly.
Thank you for coming today to the New York Historical. Really appreciate it. This is an experiment for us. This is the first ever live podcast of the Declarations podcast. So you guys are all going to be subjected to that. So thank you for being willing. But we're here to commemorate the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. Obviously, here at the New York Historical, we have tons of documents which were largely from the collection or made possible by generous donations of David Rubenstein. We wanted to ask David a couple of questions about it. So first, I just want to say, David, thank you for joining us today.
Sure. My pleasure. And thank you all for coming.
So as listeners of my podcast know, I start all of the interviews in the same way by asking, what is your declaration? But we've heard that from you because you've been my first guest. And so today I wanted to ask something different and ask about the Declaration. So the American Declaration of Independence. Why is it that the Declaration is such an enduring document?
Well, when the Declaration was approved on the night of July the 4th, it had been drafted by Thomas Jefferson. There was a 5-person committee: Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Robert Livingston, and Roger Sherman. They gave the task to draft it to Thomas Jefferson. He was 33 years old, but of all the others on the committee, he was the least busy at the time. And so they gave him the task. He also was a good writer. And he had about 15 days to draft it. He'd wait to the last 3 days, and then he drafted it. And he did it in 3 parts. There's the preamble, which was largely ignored by people at the time, the sins of King George, which were listed by him as 20, and then what we're going to do about it, which is to separate from England. At the time, it was seen as a document mostly to explain to the public why we were breaking away, and it wasn't a universally popular thing to break away. John Adams said at the time about a third of Americans wanted to break away. A third of Americans did not want to break away. They wanted to remain as British citizens, which they all were. And a third just said, I'll be with whoever wins, so I don't want to be taking a position. And the document was drafted by Jefferson. 80 changes were made by the Second Continental Congress. Jefferson was so upset that he refused to admit he had drafted it for about 9 years. He just didn't like what they had done. He sent letters to his friends saying, look what I drafted, look what they did, look, isn't that terrible? And the major change that they made of the 80 changes was they took out a provision that Jefferson had put in there that said that King George forced slavery on the United States or the colonies, which wasn't true. Slavery had been part of our system for a long time. That was taken out in large part because most of the people at the Second Continental Congress were slave owners, and they didn't want to deal with the slavery issue. And that's one of the issues that the British made fun of when they said all men are created equal in the preamble. How can you say that when you have slavery? When the document was printed on July the 5th, and then 200 copies were printed, sent to one to King George, to George Washington, and so forth, people wanted to pay attention to what we were doing about it, which is breaking away from England. That got all the attention. The reason it gets so much attention today is because of one sentence that's in the preamble.
Longest sentence ever written.
But Walter Isaacson, my suggestion, wrote this book, and I was going to co-author it with him, but I didn't think he needed me to be a co-author. So basically the sentence was, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And the idea that people should all be equal, even though Jefferson was a slave owner, captured people's attention a bit. And when revolutions occurred around the world in subsequent decades and centuries, many people would go back to that language to say, we want to have all people be equal. We want everybody to have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that kind of became the creed of America. Even though we had slavery at the time, and we had it up until 1865, we've had lots of discrimination. That was still seen as the creed or the goal of America, that everybody have equal opportunities, be equal, and have the ability to have life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. It wasn't anticipated at the time that it was drafted that it would be so famous, but that's really why it's so famous now.
So in your view, the primary reason that the Declaration of Independence has endured for this period of time is because of that one sentence?
Well, it was historic because it was breakaway, but yes, but see, all the sins of King George that are enumerated in there, to be honest, King George didn't do virtually any of those things. he was not the awful person that we made him out to be in grade school when you heard about he was mentally ill and all that. That was much later. He had mental problems.
We all know that now because we've just seen Bridgerton.
Right.
Yes.
But it's famous now because of that one sentence, but also in the sentence led to other revolutions. Interestingly, when the vote for independence occurred on July the 2nd, 1776, John Adams, who was the principal proponent of the resolution to break away, when it passed unanimously on July the 2nd, Adams wrote to his wife and said, "This will be the day we celebrate forever, July the 2nd, because this is the day we'll have fireworks forever." But why don't we celebrate July 2nd?
Just wrote an article
Right.
about this exact question, the July 2nd versus July 4th date, which I'd like you to answer, but also maybe stepping back, why do we celebrate 250 years from now if, the Revolutionary War actually started in 1775, the Constitution wasn't written until
Right.
1787. There were many events that happened in the middle. What is so important about July 2nd or July 4th, 1776?
Well, on July the 2nd, that was the day they celebrated. At the time, they didn't really think about the date that Christopher Columbus had come or when the Plymouth Rock had been created or met by the Pilgrims. They didn't really think of that. They just thought, this is the most important thing we've done to celebrate the independence of the country. When July the 2nd, 1777 arose, they were so busy at the Continental Congress fighting a war that they forgot the date. And so they just forgot, hey, at the end of the day, they said, wait a second, it's July the 2nd, we forgot to celebrate. So they got organized and they actually celebrated on the 4th. And Jefferson was not upset that they were celebrating something that he had done, the Declaration. Adams was upset that they weren't celebrating the 2nd because he was more aligned with the 2nd. The 4th, he would say the document that Jefferson drafted was anybody could have drafted it. It didn't really say anything creative or novel. So Jefferson and Adams kind of sparred for years over what was more important, July the 2nd, the vote to be independent, or July the 4th, the document. And for 50 years, these two men were rivals in many ways. And in fact, Jefferson was vice president under Adams. When Adams was president, Jefferson ran for president against his own president in 1804, and he beat Adams. In other words, in those days, you could have a president and the vice president were not from the same party. They could be from different parties. Whoever got the second most votes were vice president. Jefferson got the second most votes for president after Washington left, so he became vice president. But then in the next election, Adams ran for president a second time, and he lost to Jefferson. So they really didn't like each other too much. And in fact, Adams left town before Jefferson was inaugurated.
Did they ever reconcile?
They never met again. But in the ensuing 50 years that they lived, toward the latter 10 or 15 years, a man named Dr. Benjamin Rush had brought them together again, and they exchanged another 40 or 50 letters between the two of them, but they never actually met again. And then they both died on July the 4th, 1826, which was seen as a sign from Providence that these two great leaders, the two remaining signers of the Declaration of Independence, both died within an hour of each other on July the 4th, 1826, 50 years to the day.
And so is it because of that coincidence or the providential divine intervention that they died on July 4th, 50 years later? Is that why we celebrate July 4th? Is that actually the history?
No, we celebrate it because when they got organized to celebrate it in 1777, they celebrated on the 4th when they got organized. That date became more synonymous with the Declaration, but that's how long it took them to get organized, a day and a half. In 1870, the Congress of the United States said that federal employees would have a day off on July the 4th. So they kind of made it an official holiday and later became a more official holiday. But it was really because they forgot the first time and then they kind of began to celebrate the 4th. And because the 4th was more synonymous with the Declaration, it just took hold.
Now, it's clear that you know a lot about the Declaration of Independence. And so for those people who aren't familiar, David is known also for his patriotic philanthropy. And I think you own, what is it? Is it 12 copies of the Declaration?
I bought a lot of them and I own more than anybody else, for better or worse. And I lend them to the U.S. government. Like the National Archives, the document you may have seen upstairs is called a stone copy. And let me explain what that is. When the Declaration was agreed to, they went next door to this printer named John Dunlop, and they printed up 200 copies. It's called a broadside. Everything is on one page. And that was the text. And a copy was sent to King George. A copy was sent to George Washington to read to the troops and so forth. And that was it. But they hadn't actually signed anything. All they'd done is agreed to the text. And they wanted to sign something that looked like had calligraphy in it and looked fancy. So what they did is they asked all the people to come back who had signed it or agreed to it to sign it actually on August the 2nd, 1776. So the delegates came back and 57 people signed it more or less on August the 2nd, maybe one day later or so, but basically August 2nd. So everybody's signature was then there. John Hancock had this big signature. They didn't release the names and they didn't release that document until January because this was treason. And if you committed treason, you were probably going to be hung by the British. And so they weren't anxious to have their name out there. It wasn't until they began winning some battles in the fall of 1776 that they felt a little more comfortable they might win. So in January of 1777, they finally released the names. But the original that they signed on August the 2nd, 1776, that document is in the National Archives. It's on display. It's been there for quite a while now, since 1952. It was at the Library of Congress before. And it's faded beyond recognition. There's nothing, you can't see anything. Why is it faded? Because when they had the original, they would put it in sunlight from time to time to put it on display. They would fold it up. When the British invaded in 1814, they had to bury it some places. It got damaged. And so in 1823, John Quincy Adams, the son of John Adams, John Quincy Adams was then Secretary of State. He said, look, this document that we have, the one document we have is fading. We want people to see it with the signatures, so we should have a perfect copy made and copies made so everybody can see it. And so they found a printer in Washington named William Stone, and he came up with a process where you put a wet cloth, more or less, on top of the original document, and you take off the ink, and you take that ink, and then you put it on a copper plate, and then they made 201 copies of it. They're called stone copies, and that's the perfect replica that you see. So when you see the New York Times on 4th of July with a copy of the Declaration of Independence, it's not the original that you're seeing because that's faded beyond recognition. It's a copy of the stone copy, and I own about a dozen of them, and even the National Archives doesn't own one, so I had to lend them theirs, and I own one that was owned by James Madison, and I've lent that to Monticello, where Jefferson lived.
Hi, this is Todd Rich. Thank you for listening to the Declarations podcast, where top investors and business leaders share their insights and provide an independent perspective. We hope you're enjoying this episode. If you'd like to learn more about Declaration Partners or listen to more episodes of the Declarations podcast, please visit our website at www.declarationpartners.com. And now back to the episode. What compelled you to do this? What are you trying? And I know that all of these documents, I know that, as you just said, they're not in your own basement. They're available for public display. What is the purpose, in your view, of preserving this document?
Well, I did work in the White House for many years, or 4 years, I should say, and I've lived in Washington a long time, so you get the sense of history. But when I bought the Magna Carta, I kind of stumbled into the preservation of documents. And let me try to explain why I try to do this. The human brain is an incredible device. And when humans first appeared on the face of the earth as Homo sapiens, roughly 400,000 years ago, I imagine when they were in Southeast Africa, where humans more or less came out as Homo sapiens, I imagine that the gorillas and the elephants and the tigers were not exactly intimidated when they saw us. Say, wait, these people are not that big, they're not that fast, they're not that strong. We'll eat them up and they'll be gone soon. But it turned out that humans had a better brain than any other animal. And so that brain enabled humans to basically conquer the earth. The brain has lots of flaws. It creates Einstein kind of theories and Picasso paintings and Bernstein symphonies, but it has flaws. One flaw is that to make sure that an enemy was known to be an enemy or not, you had to be able to identify somebody by sight. And very often, if somebody looked different than you, you would have something in your brain say, I don't like that person. So somebody comes with a different skin color or a different religion, you don't like that person. So people have something in the brain that basically says, if you're not like me, I don't like you as much as if you are me. If you're same religion, same racial color, I like you more. That's a flaw the brain has. Well, another flaw, you could say it's not a flaw, but another thing in the brain is this. If I show you a copy on a computer slide of the Declaration of Independence, you can push a button and see it and then go to the next thing. If I say you're going to see an original copy of the Declaration, it has a bigger impact on the brain. And so when you see an original, like the one you saw upstairs, or you go to the National Archives and see it, before you go there, you're more likely to read about it. When you go there, you have a curator tell you about it, and afterwards you're more likely to read about it. And so you still have a greater impression on your brain by preserving these things. That's why I think it's important to preserve documents and preserve buildings. So take Mount Vernon. Mount Vernon, why are we preserving Mount Vernon? And I've been involved in that. I'm the chair of their cabinet, and I've been involved in helping to preserve Mount Vernon. Well, we have a picture of Mount Vernon. Why do we need to preserve it? Why don't we just have a picture of what George Washington lived at? And why do we need to preserve it? Because by preserving it, you remind people a little bit better of the history of the house and the history of anything. And so by preserving documents or buildings, you're reminding people of history. And why is that important? The theory behind history is that those people who don't remember history are condemned to relive it. Bad things that happened before, if you don't know what happened before, you're probably going to do the same thing again. So that's the theory of history, learning from the past and improving and doing better things. And if you don't learn history, you're probably going to make the same mistakes. So as a good example of how weak we are in history these days, if you're a naturalized American, 91% of the people who are naturalized Americans or take the test to be a naturalized American citizen pass that test. It's a test that says things like, ask you, who's the first president of the United States? How many branches are in the federal government? Who was the president of the United States during the Civil War? It's not that difficult, and 91% pass. The same test was given to 3.5 million Americans born here not too long ago, and in 49 out of 50 states, a majority of Americans born here couldn't pass the basic citizenship test, which shows you that we're not teaching American history very much. And that's, I think, not good. If you want to build on the past, you should learn about the mistakes of the past and then hopefully improve those things on the future. That's the theory.
So maybe then just to educate us, I think everyone in this room would have passed that test is my guess. But now just the lessons that you'd like to take from history, and specifically maybe the lessons from the American Revolution that you think are worth preserving, worth teaching. What are those lessons? What are the key takeaways that you would try and teach everyone?
Well, I think that the American Revolution more or less stands for the idea that when you have a government that you regard as tyrannical and not listening to your basic needs, you have an obligation to do something about it. And clearly, our revolution inspired revolutions around the world. It doesn't mean that every time you're not happy with the government, you should have a revolution. But I think it basically is a symbol of what we did here. In this country, we created with the revolution and subsequent documents, the Constitution, we created a democratic republic, and that was never done before. There hadn't been a democratic republic created like this in history. So the idea that a king wouldn't be in control was very novel. The idea that people could actually vote was very novel. And so I think it's symbolic of what the country theoretically stands for, which is people have a right to vote, exercise their opinions, say what they want to say. And that's the importance of the revolution, is reminding people why we broke away and what the rights are that we fought for.
So I've always thought of the Declaration as having, as you said, the three parts. The greatest sentence ever is a bit foundational, right? It sort of explains a little bit about the principles upon which we tried to found our democracy. Whereas perhaps maybe it's also a little bit aspirational as to the type of democracy we'd like to become. So can you talk a little bit about how that sentence and that idea has actually evolved over time?
When Jefferson wrote that sentence, you would say, how could he write that all men are created equal when he was a slave owner? He owned in his lifetime more than 600 slaves. And Jefferson did not think that all white men and all black men were equal. He didn't believe that. He did believe that when God created humans and they're kind of in a Garden of Eden, theoretically, they're equal at that time. But when they enter into society, it's not quite the same. Jefferson's view was that while slavery was abhorrent, he didn't think that he could end it politically because his political career would be over. He did early on in his career try to say that we should colonize slaves, which meant take the slaves and move them, in his case, west of the Adirondacks. And then Lincoln later had the same idea. We should move slaves to Panama or Liberia. But I think that what we got out of the Declaration was the idea that people have an inherent sense of equality and we should treat people equal. And the idea of treating people equally and letting them have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which happiness wasn't giddiness, it was meant the pursuit of a meaningful life. That was what we aspired to do.
Now, John Locke always talked about the rights to, I think it was life, liberty, and property.
That's
right?
correct.
So as a real estate guy, I actually like that formulation.
Well,
why happiness?
Jefferson was plagiarizing George Mason to some extent. And George Mason had written a document earlier for Virginia, the Declaration of Rights, that said life, liberty, and property. Jefferson used a phrase that somebody else had developed, pursuit of happiness, but happiness meant in that case the ability to lead a meaningful life. That's what it was really about. So that's kind of what he meant. But in the end, I think we look at the Declaration as a document that is embodying the principles that we hopefully will live up to and stand for, but obviously we haven't done it perfectly for sure. Many years after the Declaration was drafted, it was ignored. We won the war. We had the Articles of Confederation, then we had the Constitution, and the Constitution became the living document that governs the way we live, not the Declaration. But what happened was Lincoln, when he gave his famous Gettysburg Address, he started by saying 77 years ago, referring back to 1776, 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. That was very controversial at the time because many people in the North said, wait a second, we're not saying that all people are created equal. We're fighting to keep the Union together. We don't really want to necessarily free the slaves or to say they're equal. It was actually controversial. But Lincoln pushed that idea forward, and the idea of equality took on a new meaning again. And so Lincoln kind of revived the all men are created equal thing that Jefferson originally had written.
So clearly the Declaration has inspired a lot of people, right? Lincoln being one. I want to turn maybe to more personal. You chose to name your family office Declaration Capital. We in turn named our firm Declaration Partners, clearly as an homage to the document.
Right.
So what is it that you're trying to achieve maybe with the name Declaration? What are you trying to do with the family office? Maybe more.
Well, as anybody knows, coming up with a name is not that easy. And so when I was starting another firm called Carlyle years ago, we had all the usual Greek and Roman gods and so forth, and we couldn't pronounce a lot of them. A lot of them were taken. So one of my partners said, why don't we name it the Carlyle after the Carlyle Hotel, which seemed like a nice 2-syllable name and was kind of available.
Is there a Declaration Hotel? Is that?
Maybe there could be. But Declaration kind of reminded people of a bit about the American history and a bit of my own connection to it. So I guess that's why we did it.
Are there any lessons that you would like to take from the Declaration of Independence to the world of investing? Anything, or from the American Revolution? Anything that you learned from history, perhaps?
Well, look, everybody has an opportunity, if they're reasonably healthy and so forth, to pursue their career the way they want to do it and pursue the kind of things they think are important. So with Declaration, I was like with Carlyle or other things people have as their own institution, you want to enable people to fulfill their ambitions and fulfill their potential by, let's say, it's investing in a reasonably good way and getting returns for your investors and continuing to add value to society. What is life all about other than trying to make society better and make your own life and your children's life, your grandchildren's life, and your parents' life better than it was before? That's what life is all about, I suspect. And so what you do when you're investing is you are doing something that creates jobs, creates value. And very often today, people say that investing is just making money for rich people. And it's not quite true in my view. Obviously, a lot of investors are reasonably wealthy, but not all investors, pension funds and so forth, are representing people that are not necessarily wealthy, and they want to have as good income as possible. And so when you're investing, you're actually not doing something that is antithetical to what America is all about. Very often people say, I want to go help my country and I'll go into government or I'll go into public service. You can help your country by investing well. And an example I would like to give is this. There's an immigrant from Armenia who came to this country years ago, and he went to MIT, and he later became a investor in biotech. Very smart guy, PhD from MIT, and he started a company that was designed to do some clever biotech kinds of things, but it didn't get anywhere. It wasn't going anywhere. My son-in-law, who has a MD from Harvard and an MBA from Harvard, is a smart young man. He was willing to go to work at this biotech company to help it get somewhere. And I said, look, I've looked at this company, and for 10 years, they have not produced a product. Not one product. He's wasting his investors' money. He's got investors' money, and for 10 years, they have produced no product. And you go where you're working there, you're not going to get anywhere. Naturally, he ignored me, and he went there. And then eventually, the company created a product that saved people's lives. The company's name is Moderna. And Moderna developed the vaccine that many of you maybe have used that helped us get through COVID because of the RNA process that they developed. Had this investor, this Armenian immigrant, not persisted for 10 years and overcome all the objections of people like me and said, I'm going to keep going, we might not have had that vaccine, and maybe some of us wouldn't have lived or wouldn't have been able to survive COVID. So my example is designed to show that investors can do really good things by investing in companies that can make a difference or in properties that can make a difference and improve people's lives. And so I don't think it's fair to say that when you're investing, you're not really helping the society or creating good things for society.
I think the story also is about having a long-term perspective and sticking with it. Let's switch a little bit to maybe legacy. We are here at the New York Historical celebrating the legacy of the American Revolution. We've talked a little bit about the Declaration. On the personal side, David, what do you want your legacy to be?
Oldest living man ever. Well, everybody here, it seems to me, is probably younger than me. And you say don't worry about legacy as much. People in their 20s and 30s are not worried about legacy so much. When you get to the latter stage of your career and life, you focus on it more. And I've written in one of my books about how you divide life into thirds. The first third, you're kind of getting educated and you're getting prepared for your career. And then the second third, you're really going full steam in the career. And the third third, you're kind of resting on some of the laurels and trying to take some of the benefits of what you might have done in the second third. So I'm in the third third now. And what I'm trying to do is to set an example for other people of what they might do with their wealth and with their abilities. And also for my own children who are, I want to leave a legacy for them that they think that they've got. I keep saying I'm giving all my money away so my children will hear this and maybe not be dependent on my money. So they create their own careers. Hopefully they'll do something better than what I've done.
They have each created their own.
All in private equity. As I've said, the highest calling of mankind. They're all in private equity. But in the end, everybody wants to feel that they've done something useful with their life. Everybody wants to have their parents be proud of them. Everybody wants their children to be proud of them. Now, making your parents proud of you is a lot easier than making your children proud of you. For some of you have parents who know this. So children are never going to be proud of their parents as much as their parents will be proud of their children. But in the end, you have to say, okay, what am I doing with my life? And in the end, you try to create some legacy where people will say he or she did something useful with their life. And who knows, what people might say many years later. But so I'm trying to do as many things as I can to give back to society and within a reasonable time frame.
So we normally end the podcast with a couple of closing questions. But again, you've already done this before. So rather than asking all of the closing questions, I just want to ask one again.
Okay.
Final question. We've talked about the Declaration of Independence. We've talked about the inspiration and the rights for life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. What do you do in pursuit of happiness?
I'm interviewed by Todd Rich.
There must be something else.
Well, happiness is the most elusive thing in life. It's very difficult to be happy because no matter where you go in life, if you achieve something, you always say, I want to achieve more. It's rare that you get somebody who's achieved something and say, hey, I'm really content with what I did. I don't need to do any more. I'm just going to rest on my laurels. And people who usually rise up and get somewhere, they are not the kind of people that want to rest on their laurels. So what I'm trying to do is in the remaining years, years I have left, I'm not going to be living another 30 years or so. Try to.
We hope so. To
30 years might be a little bit much, but educate people about things that I think are worth doing, but also try to explore the kind of ideas that I have. And maybe I'm doing a lot more of that now with podcasts or with TV shows or books or so forth, but try to feel like I've came from modest circumstances and built something that hopefully is more enduring than just my lifetime span, and that ultimately helped other people make their lives somewhat better.
David, thank you for your thoughts here. Let's end on that. Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you to New York Historical.
This podcast is provided for discussion and informational purposes only, for use by Declaration Partners LP, together with its affiliates, referred to as Declaration. The information discussed in this podcast may change at any time without notice, and there is no duty by Declaration to update any person to whom this information is provided. This podcast does not constitute an offer to sell or the solicitation of an offer to purchase any investment product or any interest in the fund or any other investment vehicles or accounts managed or advised by Declaration, a Declaration investment product. in any jurisdiction to any person. Any such offer or solicitation for interest in any declaration investment product will only be made pursuant to such declaration investment product's definitive offering documents, which contain a description of the material terms, including risk factors, conflicts of interest, fees and charges, and regulatory and tax considerations relating to such declaration investment product, and which should be reviewed carefully by potential investors prior to making an investment decision. This podcast does not constitute tax or legal advice. The listener is urged to consult a professional tax and/or legal advisors regarding the possible tax, legal, economic, regulatory, or other risks and consequences associated with any investment, and must be able to bear the risks involved. This podcast may contain certain forward-looking statements, which constitute declarations' views with respect to future events, which can be identified by the use of forward-looking terminology, such as intend, seek, expect, target, project, or endeavor. These statements are made based upon such views as they exist as of the date herein. There is no assurance that such views are correct or will prove, with the passage of time, to be correct. Actual events or results may differ materially from those contemplated by such forward-looking statements as a result of factors beyond declaration's control, including, without limitation, any disruptions in global, regional, or local financial, credit, or real estate markets, acts of God, fire, hurricanes, tropical storms, floods, earthquakes, or other natural disasters, outbreaks of an infectious disease, pandemic, or any other serious public health concern, war, terrorism, labor strikes, electricity shortages, or other national or local emergencies, or any combination of the foregoing. David M. Rubenstein is an anchor investor in Declaration Partners Real Estate Fund II and is not an employee of Declaration. Neither the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission nor the Securities Regulatory Authority of any state or other jurisdiction has passed upon the accuracy or adequacy of this podcast. No compensation has been awarded to any speaker for statements made that are either testimonials or endorsements. However, certain speakers may be current or former investors in certain declaration investment products and may receive reduced fees, priority terms, priority access, co-investment rates, among other preferential treatment, which may pose a conflict of interest. Certain speakers may also be affiliates and/or service providers that receive compensation from Declaration for services provided in their service provider capacity, but have not been compensated specifically for any testimonials or endorsements made herein. The views expressed in this podcast by either the guest speaker or the host are their own and may not reflect the views of their firm or its affiliates or of Declaration. The comments made are for informational and educational purposes only and should not be considered investment, legal, or tax advice, nor a recommendation or offer to buy or sell any security or investment product. Any references to advisory services, private investments, or wealth management practices are general in nature and not indicative of future results. Past performance is not indicative of future outcomes. Examples and observations shared by the guest speaker are illustrative only and may not reflect actual client experiences. Listeners should consult their own professional advisors regarding their individual circumstances. The guest speaker may have professional relationships that could present potential conflicts of interest related to statements made by the speaker. Consequently, from the foregoing, no reliance whatsoever should be placed on this podcast, and no decision, including any investment decision, should be made based on this podcast or on the information contained herein.